If anyone saith that man is truly absolved from his sins and justified, and that by this faith alone absolution and justification are effected, let him be anathema. The Council of Trent.
So what we have to think about at the end of the 16th century is that the religious landscape was shifting, and you have a re-energized Catholicism, a militant church. But the most dynamic Protestant group at the end of the 16th century were the Calvinists. Some of the territories that had converted to Protestantism had been reclaimed by Catholicism, and some areas had converted to Calvinism. But Calvinists weren't covered by the Peace of Augsburg, so technically speaking, they weren't legal. So this is going to create a lot of tensions.
One place where tension was high was the Kingdom of Bohemia. Most of the Bohemians, including the noble class, were Protestant. Matthias, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, was positioning himself to be the next king of Bohemia. And from there, he would later become the Holy Roman Emperor.
So when Matthias became king of Bohemia, he had to be elected by the nobles. And most of the nobles in Bohemia were Protestant. And they demanded certain concessions from Matthias before they were willing to give him the throne. And this included something known as the Letter of Majesty. The Letter of Majesty is significant because in this case, it allowed religious freedom on the individual level. The previous agreements within the empire had been at the princely level. It was, whatever the religion of the prince is, that's your religion. In this case now, it's allowing essentially freedom of conscience.
As from today, no person, neither of the higher free estates, nor the inhabitants of unfree towns and villages, nor the peasants, shall be forced or compelled by any device by the authorities over them, or by any person, spiritual or temporal, to forsake his religion and accept another religion. The Letter of Majesty.
So the idea of individual rights and freedom of conscience, and I get to make my own choice, this is just unheard of.
This made the Bohemian Protestants thrilled. However, Matthias's other relative, Ferdinand II, a die-hard Jesuit-trained Catholic, was not thrilled with this idea.
Matthias is part of the Catholic Habsburg dynasty. They had rulers all over Europe. They were all related by marriage, but they didn't always get along.
Ferdinand II, as Archduke of the Tyrol, had managed to extirpate Protestantism in his region. He brought in Jesuit scholars, closed down Protestant schools and churches, and cast out all the teachers and pastors, and had managed within a few years to turn the Tyrol from a Protestant Catholic kind of mix into a die-hard, fanatically Catholic county.
When Ferdinand II was elected to be the next king of Bohemia, he promised to honor the Letter of Majesty. The problem was that no one really thought that he was going to actually keep that promise. The Protestants, who knew of Ferdinand's reputation, were really upset. A meeting was called in Prague Castle to address their grievances.
Now, the meeting got a little heated because the Protestants were definitely afraid that their religious freedom was on the line. The Catholic representatives of Matthias, some of them were a little more amenable than others, and they were allowed to leave the room. However, two others and their secretary remained. These guys were the hardline anti-Protestant Catholics. These gentlemen thought that they were going to arrest them and they could become martyrs, being wrongfully imprisoned by these gentlemen. What they did not expect was that the Protestants then grabbed them and threw them out the window. This is known as the defenestration of Prague.
So defenestration is just a long word. It simply means out the window. And actually, this is not the first defenestration of Prague. This has happened before in Prague, because apparently that's what angry Czechs do.
The previous defenestration of Prague that marked the Hussite Wars, the men that they threw out died. So they threw these men out, two of them and their secretary, and amazingly, all three of the men survived.
I've actually been to Prague. I've looked at the window. I've looked at it from the outside and the inside, and I can tell you it's a long drop. Now,
of course, this episode began to gather stories because these men managed to walk from such a terrible drop?
The Catholics said that they were saved or caught by angels of the divine hand.
The Protestants said, well, they landed on a pile of manure. Either way, this episode began the 30 Years' War.
As Ferdinand II is dealing with this issue, he is elected as the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He immediately prepares for war.
The war was an unmitigated disaster. It wiped out possibly up to a third of Germany's population. The human misery and the cost was terrible. So the armies oftentimes went unfunded, and the states did not have the capital to raise these forces. And so how these armies sustained themselves was by going into a territory. They occupied the territory. Cavalry served the purpose of spreading out, fanning over this territory, and collecting the contribution tax, usually in the form of food and supplies, and then bringing it back into the army. Naturally, peasants were devastated by this because they were not compensated for their material. It was justified as a tax, and they lost it. And the war moved around Germany based upon where armies had already been. If armies had been in a territory too long, it was unsustainable to stay there because all the food had been taken away. The troops would starve. For example, in the 1620s, a historian noted that when the Swedish army was in Estonia, the year before the Swedish army was there was close to, say, a couple thousand cattle, tens of thousands of chickens, and then on the tax registers the next year after the Swedish army had left, there were no cattle and 3 chickens left in the province. This is why peasants starved, and what this created was artificial famine within Germany. The war being so long and complicated, historians generally have divided up into 4 phases, first being the Bohemian phase, then the Danish phase, then the Swedish phase, then the French phase. The Bohemian phase, the Bohemians lost miserably. You even had Lutherans fighting on the side of the emperor. This terrified the nearby King of Denmark, who decided to intervene in the war and suddenly bringing an international element into this. The King of Denmark, however, was not ready to face off against the combined power of most of the German princes behind the emperor, and his territories were overrun and he lost. Then, using this as an excuse, Ferdinand continued to roll back Protestant privileges within the empire and assert more absolute power. This alarmed the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, and he intervened, beginning the Swedish phase. Now, Gustavus Adolphus's army was the most modern army at the time. It was the most advanced militarily in terms of its techniques and technologies used. Historians today oftentimes refer to him as the father of modern warfare. His Swedish army was trained and experienced after fighting in Poland over most of the 1620s, and when they showed up in Germany, they won in battle after battle after battle. Within 2 years, he had conquered Prague, and he was at the gates of Vienna. Now, at this point, things went wrong for the Protestants. Gustavus died in battle. The story goes, his officers told him before a cavalry charge to put his armor on. He looked at them and he said, "The Lord God is my armor," and he charged off into battle. 30 minutes later, his horse came back without its rider. Gustavus had died, and the Protestant war effort at that point had lost its leader. The Catholics began to roll back the Protestant tide. This alarmed another power, and this was specifically France. Now, at this time, French foreign policy was not actually run by King Louis XIII. It was actually run by his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, as in a cardinal, a prince of the church, a man who elects the pope, a very, very Catholic individual. However, Richelieu had been actively, secretly aiding Protestant enemies of the Catholic Habsburgs wherever he could. He had been paying subsidies to the Swedes. He had also been paying subsidies to the Dutch in their wars against the Spanish. So in 1635, Richelieu declared war on the Spanish and then in turn declared war on their cousins, the Austrian Habsburgs, and this began the French phase of the war. Now there were the Lutheran princes on the side of the French and the Swedes, and some Lutherans even joined up on the side of the emperor, each one taking sides, trying to sort out the whole mess. The Swedes actually managed to take Prague by 1645, which, oddly enough, was the very place where the whole thing started. In 1648, the war, thankfully, was finally brought to a close in Germany with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was designed to be amenable to all parties to the treaty. However, it was not necessarily amenable to those outside of the war, and all parties agreed to ignore these sides, which included the papacy, which was furious with the fact that Protestantism had not been extirpated or rolled back at the end of the treaty. The Pope declared it null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, and meaningless. European leaders, both Catholic and Protestant, ignored his opinion.
The 30 Years' War didn't end all of the fighting over Protestantism in Europe, but it did bring about the idea of a sovereign state where the rulers of the state, not the Pope, would be in charge. And the idea of freedom of conscience and individual rights would gain importance.
So Henry sent a request to the Pope in Rome asking for a dispensation of the marriage that would grant him an annulment. The only problem was
Henry's timing was horrible. Charles V was sacking Rome, and Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon.